Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are looking at something really significant. A scenario that honestly could reshape not just the U.S. economy, but maybe even the balance of power in Washington itself.
That's right.
We're diving into this major hypothetical, but one that feels very close to reality right now. What happens if the Supreme Court actually strikes down those huge, sweeping emergency tariffs the administration put in place back in early 2025?
And it's critical to understand this isn't just some niche trade regulation story, not at all. It's potentially a constitutional crisis hiding in plain sight, wrapped up in, customs forms and trade statistics.
Okay, so set the stakes for us. How big are we talking here?
We're talking astronomical figures.
Yeah.
To really grasp the scale, think about the money involved. Just in 2025, the first year, estimates suggest these tariffs pulled in somewhere between, say, $80 billion and $90 billion.
80 to 90 billion. 1 year.
Yes, and that's just the start. If these tariffs were allowed to continue, if they stood for the next decade, so 2025 through 2034, the projections are just staggering. We're looking at nearly $1.8 trillion.
Wow. $1.8 trillion.
That's the $1.8 trillion question, really. Who actually has the constitutional authority to levy that kind of tax on the American economy? Is it the president, acting alone through emergency powers? Or is it Congress, where the Constitution originally placed the taxing power?
And this isn't just speculation anymore, is it? The administration's legal footing seems, well, pretty shaky already.
It really does. The lower courts have consistently ruled against the administration on this. They've expressed deep skepticism about the legal justification used. And now, crucially, we've seen signals from the Supreme Court itself during oral arguments.
And not just from the expected justices, right?
Exactly. Justices across the ideological spectrum, including members of the conservative majority, have voiced profound doubts. So the question hanging over Washington isn't really if these tariffs are good or bad economic policy. The real question the court is grappling with is who gets to decide that policy, who holds the power.
So our mission today is clear. We're going to unpack all of it. What would be the immediate economic shock if these tariffs suddenly vanished?
Yeah.
What about the logistical chaos? I mean, that refund issue sounds messy.
Oh, incredibly messy.
Then there are the global trade implications. What does this signal to allies and rivals? And, of course, the huge constitutional questions about executive power. What lines are being drawn?
And finally, the political fallout. How does this play out for the administration, for Congress, for both parties? It's complex.
It really is. So this deep dive is going to trace the journey of this enormous amount of money, this contested power, through the legal system.
Right. And the eventual ruling, whichever way it goes, but especially if it strikes down the tariffs, it won't just be a footnote. It'll be a landmark decision. It impacts importers, exporters, consumers, sure. But the bigger story is about the fundamental balance of power between the White House and Capitol Hill.
It essentially asks, can a president fundamentally rewrite America's tax and trade posture unilaterally just by declaring something an emergency?
That's the core question. Let's dig in.
Okay, let's start by getting specific about the tariffs themselves. What exactly did the administration implement back in early 2025 that's now under scrutiny? These weren't just minor tweaks, were they?
No, not at all. These were sledgehammer policies, really, designed for immediate drastic impact. There were two main components rolled out almost simultaneously.
What was the first one?
The first was maybe the most shocking in its breadth. A 10% global tariff, just boom, across the board, applied to essentially all imported goods coming into the United States, regardless of where they came from.
Wow. So Canada, Mexico, Germany, Japan, everyone got hit with this extra 10%.
Pretty much everyone. It was a deliberate attempt to use protectionism on a scale we haven't really seen since, maybe the 1930s. It effectively treated every single import as subject to this flat tax, a really dramatic, blunt instrument.
Okay, that's the global piece. What was the second part? You said it was two-pronged?
Right. The second measure was potentially even more disruptive, or at least more targeted and punitive. These were the so-called reciprocal tariffs.
Reciprocal, meaning what exactly?
Meaning the administration gave itself the discretion to slap additional tariffs, potentially as high as 50%, 50% on top of the 10%, on goods from specific countries that it unilaterally deemed were treating the U.S. unfairly in trade matters.
So a country could face a 10% base tariff plus another, say, 30, 40, even 50% if the administration decided they were being unfair. That could mean total tariffs of 60%.
Exactly. It created this potential for an absolutely crushing barrier to trade for certain nations or certain goods, and the criteria for unfairness were shall we say, quite broad and politically defined by the administration. This combination, the 10% global floor plus these potentially huge reciprocal tariffs, meant a massive increase in costs for anyone relying on imports. Manufacturers, retailers, and ultimately consumers.
Okay, so massive new taxes on imports. Normally, Article 1 of the Constitution is pretty clear. Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. How did the administration justify doing this on its own?
They used the magic word, emergency. They declared two separate national emergencies. This was the legal key they tried to use to unlock a specific statute.
Two emergencies, what were they?
Well, the first one was a link to a very real and serious crisis, fentanyl trafficking. In that declaration, they specifically called out countries like Canada, Mexico, and China as being involved in the illicit supply chain.
Hold on. Using a public health crisis, a law enforcement issue like fentanyl, to justify a global tariff on all goods. That seems like quite a stretch, legally speaking. Connecting, say, French wine or German cars to fentanyl seems tenuous at best.
It absolutely is a stretch, and that was a major point of contention in the lower courts. But the administration wasn't done. The second emergency declaration was, frankly, much more revealing about the actual policy goals.
What was the second one?
They declared a national emergency based directly on the U.S. trade deficit itself. The sheer existence of a trade deficit was framed as a crisis situation, and they even gave the tariffs imposed under this rationale a specific name, the Liberation Day tariffs.
Liberation Day. Liberating from what? Imports.
Presumably. It signaled very clearly that the administration viewed the trade deficit, which is a complex structural feature of the economy, debated by economists for decades, not as a policy challenge to be managed, but as an acute emergency justifying extraordinary unilateral executive action. They were essentially trying to define a long-term economic metric as a sudden crisis.
So these emergency declarations were the prerequisite to invoke a specific law.
Exactly. That brings us to the legal hook. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, passed way back in 1977.
IEPA. Okay, I think many listeners might have heard of this, usually in the context of sanctions, right? Like freezing assets of terrorists or rogue states.
That's precisely its origin and primary intended use. IEPA was born out of older wartime statutes, but it was specifically designed in the 70s as a tool for foreign policy crises. Think of it as a financial weapon for the president.
What kind of weapon?
Primarily things like imposing sanctions on specific countries or groups, freezing foreign assets held in the U.S., blocking financial transactions, restricting access to the U.S. financial system. It was built to disrupt money flows tied to specific national security or foreign policy threats. Think Iran, North Korea, terrorist organizations. It's a target scalpel.
So it's a scalpel designed for freezing bank accounts, and the administration argued it also authorizes using a sledgehammer to tax literally everything coming into the country.
That is the absolute core of the legal dispute. The administration looked at IEPA and essentially said, this emergency law gives us the power to do almost anything related to international economics, including setting massive import taxes.
And the lower courts didn't buy that interpretation?
Not at all. They looked closely at the text of IEPA, its legislative history, its consistent use over decades for sanctions and financial measures, and they concluded that it does not provide clear, explicit authorization for the president to impose tariffs on this scale. Tariffs, they noted, are duties, imposts, taxes, essentially, and the power to tax is constitutionally vested in Congress.
So the cases now before the Supreme Court, you mentioned Learning Resources v. Trump and Trump v. VOS Elections, Inc., they're not really about whether tariffs are good or bad for the economy, are they?
No, not directly. The court isn't being asked to rule on the wisdom of protectionism versus free trade. The legal question is much more fundamental. Did the president usurp Congress's core constitutional power to tax when he used IEPA this way? It's a separation of powers case through and through.
Let's just quickly ground this again in the economic stakes, because it highlights why this isn't just a legal debate. If the court were to somehow agree with the administration and let these tariffs stand, what do economic forecasts predict?
Well, as we mentioned, the revenue is huge, but the economic consensus on the impact is pretty negative. If both the 10% global tariff and the reciprocal tariffs were to stay in place long term, most major economic models project a drag on U.S. GDP.
How much of a drag?
The projections center around a cut of about 4.4% to annual U.S. GDP.
Right.
Now, 0.4% might not sound enormous, but in an economy the size of the U.S., that's a substantial amount of lost wealth year after year. And maybe more tangibly for listeners.
Jobs.
Yes, jobs. The same forecast suggests these tariffs, if sustained, could cost the U.S. economy hundreds of thousands of jobs. This comes from increased costs for businesses using imports, reduced competitiveness for U.S. exporters facing retaliatory tariffs abroad, and overall disruption to supply chains.
So the Supreme Court's decision isn't just abstract constitutional law. It has the potential to either avert or lock in a significant multi-year economic headwind for the country.
Precisely. That's why the stakes are so incredibly high, both constitutionally and economically.
Okay, so the case has reached the Supreme Court. The justices aren't primarily concerned with GDP forecasts or job numbers. They're looking at the Constitution, specifically Article 1, Section 8. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. That seems pretty clear. How did the administration's lawyers try to argue that IEEPA, a 1977 statute, somehow overrides that fundamental grant of power to Congress?
They faced an uphill battle from the start, a really steep climb. Their main argument centered on a specific phrase within the IEEPA statute. The law says the president, during a declared emergency, can regulate importation of property in which any foreign country or national has an interest.
Regulate importation. That's the key phrase they relied on.
That was the hook. They argued that the word regulate is inherently broad. Broad enough, they claimed, to encompass the power to impose conditions on importation, and that those conditions could include taxes, duties, or tariffs, especially in an emergency context. They were basically saying regulate implies the power to tax imports if needed for the regulation.
How did that argument land with the justices, based on the reporting from the oral arguments? It sounds like it didn't go over too well, even with justices who might normally be sympathetic to executive power arguments.
It landed with a thud, frankly. The skepticism was palpable, and crucially, it came from across the ideological spectrum. The justices weren't just questioning the edges of the argument, they were questioning the very foundation.
So this wasn't just the liberal justices pushing back.
Not at all. In fact, some of the sharpest questioning came from the conservative wing, particularly justices appointed by this very administration. This highlighted what you could call the conservative conundrum here.
What do you mean by that?
Well, justices like Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett are known for being strong proponents of textualism, originalism, and, very importantly, the separation of powers. They believe Congress makes laws, the president executes them. So an executive action that looks like it's encroaching on Congress's core legislative power, like the power to tax, is going to raise major red flags for them, regardless of who is in the White House.
Let's dig into Justice Barrett's line of questioning. She's often seen as a key figure on the court's textualist approach. How does she pick apart that regulate importation argument?
Justice Barrett went straight to the text and historical usage, which is her forte. She challenged the administration's lawyers directly. Can you point to any historical or legal precedent where the power to regulate importation was understood to include the power to impose a tax for general revenue purposes?
And could they?
They struggled significantly. Justice Barrett pointed out that the Constitution itself, and centuries of legal usage, consistently distinguishes between regulation and taxation. Tariffs are specifically called duties or imposts. She essentially asked, if Congress meant to give the president the power to tax imports in IEEPA, why didn't they use the words tax, duty, or impost? Why rely on this arguably vaguer term, regulate?
So a classic textualist critique.
Yeah.
The words Congress didn't use are just as important as the words they did use.
Exactly. And she didn't stop at the textual point. She also pressed hard on the scope of the action taken under the emergency rationale. This went back to the justification issue we discussed.
Right, the fentanyl and trade deficit emergency.
Yes. She questioned the logical link between the declared emergencies and the global nature of the tariffs, especially the reciprocal ones. She asked something like, you're claiming these tariffs are needed because of threats, say, to the defense industrial base. Okay, I might see that argument for certain countries, but explain to me why that justifies imposing potentially massive tariffs on imports from, say, Spain or France.
She was pointing out the mismatch between the supposedly specific emergency and the incredibly broad, almost universal remedy being applied.
Precisely. She was suggesting the emergency seemed more like a convenient pretext to achieve a desired policy outcome, broad protectionism, rather than a tailored response to a genuine specific crisis covered by IEP. It exposed the potential absurdity of the justification.
And then there was Justice Gorsuch. His focus seemed even more fundamental, drilling down on the core constitutional assignment of the taxing power.
Yes, Justice Gorsuch really zeroed in on the historical and structural importance of keeping the taxing power with Congress. He emphasized that this wasn't just some arbitrary choice by the founders. The constitutional assignment of the taxing power specifically to Congress was a deliberate safeguard against executive overreach, against the kind of arbitrary power wielded by the crown before the Revolution.
He used some strong language, didn't he?
He did. He said something to the effect that the power to reach into the pockets of the American people is just different since the founding. It's the most sensitive power, the one most directly felt by citizens, and therefore requires the highest degree of democratic accountability, which comes through the legislature, not the executive branch acting alone.
So the idea that a president could effectively fund government operations or reshape the economy through unilateral import taxes just fundamentally violates that structure.
That was clearly his view. It bypasses the entire system of appropriations and revenue raising that the Constitution carefully assigns to Congress.
Now, the administration did try to counter this tariffs or taxes argument, right? They tried to frame them differently.
They did. Their lawyers argued that these tariffs were primarily regulatory in nature. The goal, they claimed, wasn't mainly to raise revenue, but to regulate trade flows, protect domestic industry, and pressure other countries to change their behavior. The massive amount of money collected, that nearly $1.8 trillion projection, was described as only incidental to the main regulatory purpose.
Incidental revenue. $80 to $90 billion a year is incidental. How did that go over?
It was met with immediate and frankly almost incredulous pushback, particularly from the court's liberal wing, but the skepticism was broad. Justice Sotomayor, for instance, stated it very directly, something like, "You want to say tariffs are not taxes, but that's exactly what they are. They function as taxes. They are generating enormous sums of money from American citizens and businesses."
And didn't the administration's own rhetoric outside the courtroom contradict this incidental revenue claim?
Completely. The president had repeatedly and publicly boasted about the billions of dollars flowing into the Treasury because of the tariffs, often framing it as money paid by foreign countries, which economists overwhelmingly say is incorrect. Tariffs are primarily paid by domestic importers and consumers. So the legal argument in court that the money was just a side effect clashed dramatically with the political messaging outside the court.
This whole picture, the scale of the economic impact, the questionable use of an old statute, the clear encroachment on Congress's taxing power, it seems to lead directly to one major legal doctrine the current Supreme Court has been using quite a bit.
Absolutely. All signs pointed towards the major questions doctrine.
Explain that for us. What is the major questions doctrine and why is it so relevant here?
The major questions doctrine is essentially a rule of statutory interpretation the court has increasingly employed, particularly the conservative majority. It holds that if an executive agency or the president wants to take an action that has vast economic or political significance, they can't rely on vague or ambiguous language in an old general statute.
They need something more specific.
They need clear, explicit authorization from Congress for that specific type of major action. Congress must speak clearly if it intends to delegate power of such magnitude. The court is basically saying, we won't assume Congress meant to hand over transformative power in hidden corners of old laws. Big decisions require big, clear legislative calls.
And imposing potentially $1.8 trillion in new import taxes certainly qualifies as having vast economic significance.
Undeniably. It's hard to imagine a clearer example. It touches nearly every sector of the economy and has profound implications for U.S. foreign relations.
Did Chief Justice Roberts give any indication of where he stood on applying this doctrine? He's often seen as the crucial vote.
He did. During the arguments, Chief Justice Roberts explicitly suggested that the major questions doctrine seems directly applicable to the situation. He questioned the legitimacy of using a 1977 statute, primarily intended for sanctions, to suddenly authorize the executive to impose tariffs on potentially any product from any country for any amount for any length of time.
That phrasing, any product, any country, any amount, any length of time, really highlights the sheer breadth of the power the administration was claiming under IEEPA.
It does. It underscores the court's concern about unchecked executive discretion. If the court rules against the administration invoking the major questions doctrine, it won't just be about these specific tariff. It will be a major statement reinforcing this doctrine as a primary judicial check on executive power across the board. It's the court drawing a very bright line in the constitutional sand.
Okay, let's assume the court does draw that line. They rule that IEEPA does not authorize these broad tariffs. The legal theory is fascinating, but what happens the next day? Let's talk about the immediate, real-world economic consequences. First off, what specific tariffs would actually disappear?
Right, this is a critical point. The ruling wouldn't wipe the slate clean on all tariffs. It would specifically target those measures implemented under the contested IEEPA authority.
So that means?
That means the global 10% tariff, the blanket tax on almost everything, would be gone. And the additional reciprocal tariffs, those discretionary penalties of up to 50% on specific countries, would also be invalidated because they relied on the same IEEPA emergency declarations.
And together, those represented the bulk of the administration's big tariff push, revenue-wise.
Absolutely. Removing those two components essentially dismantles the core of the administration's aggressive 2025 protectionist strategy. Estimates are that this would eliminate something like 70% or more of the tariff revenue the administration had been collecting under these new measures. It's a huge chunk.
But importantly, it's not all tariffs. Some would remain.
Correct. Tariffs imposed under different laws, with arguably stronger legal justifications, would likely remain standing. The most significant examples are the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, which were justified, controversially but under a different statute, on national security grounds.
Well, it's been around for a while.
Yes. And also, crucially, the existing Section 301 tariffs, which were imposed during the previous term, primarily targeting China. Those were justified based on findings of unfair trade practices like intellectual property theft and forced technology transfer, again, using a different statutory authority than IEEPA.
So even if the IEEPA tariffs fall, a significant portion of imports, especially from China, would still face high duties.
That's right. By some estimates, even after this hypothetical ruling, about 16% of all U.S. imports by value would still be subject to significant tariffs. And for China specifically, the situation remains quite protectionist. Because the Section 301 tariffs are so extensive, China's trade-weighted average tariff rate on goods entering the U.S. would likely remain extremely high, probably still over 40%.
So the ruling would be a major rollback of the broadest tariffs, but not a complete abandonment of using tariffs as a tool, especially regarding China.
Exactly. It's curbing the unilateral emergency aspect, not necessarily eliminating all forms of protectionism authorized by other statutes.
Okay, now for what sounds like the biggest immediate headache, the money. If the court says these IEEPA tariffs were unlawful from the start, what happens to the $80–90 billion collected just in 2025, let alone potentially more from subsequent years?
This triggers the refund nightmare. Legally, if a tax is declared unconstitutional or unlawfully imposed, the money collected under it becomes suspect. Importers who paid those duties now have a legal right to claim that money back from the government.
Tens of billions of dollars in potential refunds. How would that even work?
It would be an administrative catastrophe for U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, and the Treasury Department. They would be inundated with potentially hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, of refund claims from importers, large and small.
What's involved in making a claim?
Oh, it's incredibly complex. An importer would need to provide detailed documentation for every single shipment that was subject to the unlawful tariff. They'd need entry forms, proof of duty payment, invoices, potentially demonstrating the country of origin, classifying the goods correctly. It's a mountain of paperwork, often going back years.
And CBP would have to process all of this.
Yes. Verify each claim, calculate the refund amount, which might involve currency fluctuations and interest calculations, and eventually issue payments. The sheer volume would create a backlog stretching potentially for years. We're talking about a bureaucratic avalanche. And the total amount subject to claims could easily spiral into the hundreds of billions if the tariffs were in place for more than just that first year.
The source material we looked at really emphasized the unfairness baked into this refund process. It's not like everyone who paid gets their money back easily.
Not at all. This is where the inequality becomes really stark. Who do you think is best positioned to navigate this bureaucratic maze?
The big guys, I assume. The multinational corporations.
Exactly. The large corporations, the major auto companies, the big box retailers, the global electronics firms, they have sophisticated in-house legal departments, expensive trade consultants on retainer, and the financial reserves to pursue these claims aggressively. They will be first in line, filing meticulously prepared claims for refunds that could run into the billions for a single company.
But what about the smaller businesses? The ones mentioned in the court cases, like the educational toy importer, learning resources, or the wine distributor VOS selections. They were already struggling under the weight of these tariffs.
They are at a profound disadvantage. Many small and medium-sized businesses operate on much thinner margins. Some might have already gone out of business because of the tariffs. Those still standing likely lack the specialized legal expertise and the administrative bandwidth to compile and fight for these refunds effectively.
So they paid an unlawful tax that maybe crippled their business, and now they might not even be able to get the money back because the process is too complex or costly.
That's the real risk. It's a cruel irony. They were hammered by the policy coming in, and they might miss out on the remedy going out. It adds insult to injury and highlights how blunt policy instruments often have deeply unequal consequences.
Okay, moving beyond the immediate refund chaos, what's the broader expected shift in the economy once these tariffs are removed?
Yeah.
You mentioned it's like taking a weight off.
Yes, economists generally see removing broad tariffs like this as removing a significant drag on the system. The most direct and noticeable effect for many people would likely be on consumer prices.
Prices would come down.
Eventually, yes. Maybe not overnight, but the removal of that 10% and potentially more tax on imported goods like electronics, clothing, furniture, auto parts, and various retail items would reduce costs for importers and retailers. Competition should then push those savings, or at least some portion of them, through to consumers in the form of lower price increases or even some outright price reductions.
So it could help ease inflation.
It should modestly improve the overall inflation picture, yes. It wouldn't solve inflation entirely, obviously, but removing a significant cost layer across so many goods would certainly help push things in the right direction.
What about other parts of the economy? Exporters.
U.S. exporters should also see some benefit. Many countries hit by the U.S. tariffs impose retaliatory tariffs on American goods, think agriculture, like soybeans, or manufactured goods like motorcycles or whiskey. If the U.S. removes its broad IEEPA tariffs, those foreign countries would likely ease or eliminate their retaliatory measures, making U.S. exports cheaper and more competitive again in those markets.
Okay, sounds mostly positive, lower prices, better export prospects. But surely there's a downside for some sectors domestically.
Absolutely. There's always a domestic backlash when protectionist measures are removed. Industries that benefited from the tariff wall reducing foreign competition will suddenly face renewed pressure.
Which industries are we talking about primarily?
Think about the sectors that received the most direct protection. Steel, aluminum, certain types of light manufacturing, maybe some specific automotive parts sectors where import competition is fierce. These companies and their workers lobbied hard for the tariffs and will face significant adjustment challenges as cheaper imports potentially flow back in more easily.
So politically, the administration can't just celebrate lower prices. They'll face intense pressure from these specific industries that feel abandoned.
Intense pressure, and this will force an immediate policy pivot. If the broad tariff weapon is taken away by the court, the administration will have to find other ways to support these industries and pursue its industrial policy goals.
What kinds of replacement policies would they likely turn to?
They'd have to lean much more heavily on tools that are generally seen as legally sounder, even if still controversial. Things like targeted subsidies, we already see this with the CGPS Act for semiconductors, or incentives for electric vehicles and batteries. Expect more pushes for subsidies in other strategic sectors.
What else?
Also strengthening Buy American mandates for government procurement, trying to steer federal spending towards domestic producers, and perhaps more use of existing, albeit narrower, trade remedy laws like anti-dumping and countervailing duties. Essentially, the strategy shifts from a blunt economy-wide tax to a more complex, targeted mix of subsidies and narrower trade restrictions.
The economic fallout is clearly huge and complex. But let's pivot back to the constitutional implications, because those might be even more profound in the long run. If the court strikes down these tariffs, especially using the major questions doctrine, what's the big message being sent?
The big message is a reassertion of fundamental constitutional structure. The court would be saying, unequivocally, that major, big, structural economic changes, things that reshape entire industries or impose massive new costs on the public, are legislative functions, not executive ones.
So policy by decree is out, at least for these really big economic questions.
Exactly. The court is essentially policing the boundaries between the branches. They're saying that constitutional hygiene, following the proper process laid out in the Constitution, matters more than the perceived urgency or desirability of any particular policy goal. The executive branch cannot just grab powers that belong to Congress, even if it thinks it can do a better or faster job.
During the oral arguments, Justice Gorsuch brought up this really interesting and slightly alarming concept, the one-way ratchet toward the gradual but continual accretion of power in the executive branch. He called it the retrieval problem. Can you unpack that? It sounds really important for understanding why this case matters beyond just tariffs.
It's a crucial point about how power shifts in Washington, and it gets right to the heart of the separation of powers concern. The one-way ratchet idea is based on the simple mechanics of how laws are made and potentially unmade.
How does the ratchet work?
Think about it this way. For Congress to delegate a power to the executive branch, maybe vaguely, like the administration argued happened with IEP, it typically only takes a simple majority vote in both the House and Senate, plus the president's signature. Presidents are usually happy to sign laws that give them more authority.
Okay, so relatively easy to give power away. 50% plus one in each chamber, and the president agrees.
Right. But now, suppose Congress later realizes it gave away too much power, or the president is abusing that delegated authority. What does it take for Congress to retrieve that power, to take it back?
They'd have to pass a new law saying you can't do that anymore.
Exactly. They'd need to pass a new statute explicitly limiting or repealing the delegation. But what happens if the president doesn't want to give that power back?
He vetoes the law.
Precisely. And to override a presidential veto, Congress doesn't just need a simple majority. It needs a two-thirds supermajority in both the House and the Senate.
Ah, so the threshold for taking power back, 2/3, is much, much higher than the threshold for giving it away, simple majority.
That's the one-way ratchet. Power flows to the executive relatively easily, but it's incredibly difficult for Congress to claw it back once it's gone, especially if the president resists. The ratchet clicks forward, giving the executive more power, but it rarely clicks back.
And Justice Gorsuch's point was that this gradual accumulation of power in the executive branch undermines the original constitutional design.
Yes, especially when it comes to Congress's most fundamental powers, like the power of the purse, the power to tax and spend. The founders deliberately put that power in Congress because it's the branch closest to the people, the most accountable. If the president can effectively gain taxing power through vague interpretations of old statutes, and Congress can't realistically get it back because of the veto hurdle, then the executive starts to look a lot less like a president and more like the monarch the founders fought against, someone who can fund their own priorities without direct legislative consent.
So a ruling against the tariffs, based on the major questions doctrine, isn't just about IEP. It's about stopping that ratchet from clicking forward on one of Congress's most critical powers.
It's a major pushback against that trend. It's the court saying, this core power, the power to tax, is too important to be given away implicitly. If Congress wants to delegate taxing authority, it has to do so with extreme clarity.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting for the future. This logic demanding clear congressional authorization for major executive actions presumably won't just apply to trade policy, right? How could this precedent ripple across other policy areas?
It has potentially huge implications across the board. Once the court firmly establishes this strong version of the major questions doctrine, especially regarding something as central as taxing power, it becomes a powerful precedent that litigants will use to challenge executive actions in many other fields.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Okay, think about climate policy. Future administrations, perhaps wanting to implement very ambitious greenhouse gas regulations across the economy, might try to find authority in older, broader language in laws like the Clean Air Act. A strong major questions precedent from the tariff case would make such efforts much harder. Courts would likely demand much clearer, more specific congressional instructions before allowing agencies to impose regulations with such vast economic impact.
So it could constrain environmental regulation.
It could force Congress to legislate more explicitly on climate change rather than relying on agencies to interpret old statutes aggressively. The same logic applies elsewhere.
What about technology? Things like AI or social media are moving so fast, and Congress often lags behind. Could presidents try to use emergency powers there?
That's another key area. Imagine a future president declaring an emergency related to AI safety or disinformation on social media and trying to use older laws, maybe communications laws or national security statutes, to impose sweeping new regulations or controls. The major questions doctrine, strengthened by the tariff ruling, would provide a basis to challenge such moves, arguing that regulating these novel, complex sectors requires fresh, explicit legislation from Congress, not executive fiat based on strained readings of old laws.
What about finance? You mentioned IEPA was originally about financial sanctions.
Right. Even in the realm of financial regulation or monetary policy, the doctrine could have teeth. For instance, if an administration tried to implement truly transformative measures, maybe related to systemic risk, or even something futuristic like a central bank digital currency, CBDC, relying solely on existing emergency powers or vague statutory authority, you'd likely see challenges based on the major questions doctrine. The court is signaling that fundamental shifts in the structure of the economy or the financial system need clear legislative backing.
It sounds like the court is trying to force major policy debates back into Congress, whether Congress is ready for them or not.
In a way, yes. It's reinforcing the idea that Congress is the primary lawmaker for significant issues, and the executive's role is to execute those laws, not create major new policies out of whole cloth based on reinterpretations of statutes.
Now, the source material we reviewed draws a connection between the administration's approach in the tariff case and a broader governing philosophy. You described it earlier as potentially reckless disregard of limits, a sort of move fast and break things mentality applied to governance. Can you elaborate on the other examples mentioned that seem to fit this pattern?
Yes, the argument is that the tariff situation isn't an isolated incident, but reflects a pattern of pushing constitutional and legal boundaries when they become inconvenient to the administration's goals. The source material pointed to a couple of other concerning examples.
What was the first one? Something about SNAP payments?
Yes, the situation involving SNAP benefits the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or food stamps, during a government shutdown standoff with Congress. The administration reportedly threatened to not distribute the full benefits owed to recipients, essentially using essential food aid for vulnerable populations, including many within their own political base, as leverage in a political negotiation.
That seems highly problematic. Did
Yeah.
they actually cut the benefits?
Yeah. The courts intervened and ordered the administration to make the full payments. But here's the more alarming part. According to the sources, the administration then signaled it might potentially defy those court orders.
Defy a court order regarding essential benefits.
The threat itself, even if not ultimately carried out, reflects a worrying perspective on the rule of law. Threatening to ignore a judicial order, especially one ensuring basic necessities for citizens, suggests a view where executive power is paramount and legal checks are obstacles to be overcome or ignored rather than respected limits. It fits that disregard of limits pattern.
And the second example mentioned was even more serious, involving the use of military force. The crime is not war scenario.
This one is perhaps the most chilling example of blurring lines and expanding executive power into dangerous territory. The administration reportedly adopted a rationale that declared a formal armed conflict existed with certain international drug cartels.
A war with drug cartels,
Yep.
not a law enforcement action.
That was the controversial leap. By framing it as a armed conflict, the administration sought to justify using military rules of engagement rather than law enforcement standards against suspected drug traffickers, even potentially far from U.S. territory, like in international waters.
What does that mean in practice? Using military force instead of arresting suspects?
It could mean exactly that. Instead of the standard maritime law enforcement approach, interdicting a suspicious vessel, searching it, arresting the crew, if evidence of trafficking is found, the armed conflict rationale could be used to justify direct armed strikes against suspected trafficking vessels, potentially killing the occupants without attempting arrest or due process.
That completely bypasses the criminal justice system.
It bypasses domestic and international legal norms surrounding law enforcement. It applies a wartime logic to a situation traditionally handled through policing and judicial processes. The source material raised the stark question: if crime is now war, then who can't the president kill?
That's a terrifying question.
It highlights the danger of unilaterally redefining terms like war and emergency to amass power. If the executive can declare war on a non-state criminal group, does that mean they can target anyone, anywhere deemed connected to that group without the constraints of domestic law or congressional authorization for the use of military force?
So the argument is that the Supreme Court pushing back hard on the misuse of IEEPA for tariffs isn't just about trade law. It's about potentially reining in a much broader executive philosophy that sees legal limits as suggestions rather than binding constraints, whether the issue is taxes, benefits, or even lethal force.
Exactly. The tariff case becomes a proxy battle over the fundamental nature of executive power and respect for the rule of law in the American system. A strong ruling upholding the separation of powers on tariffs could send a powerful signal across all areas of government.
Okay, let's broaden the lens again. If the Supreme Court does strike down these IEEPA tariffs, how does the rest of the world react? The source material suggests it sends two very different, almost contradictory messages simultaneously. What's the first narrative? The more positive one.
The first narrative, let's call it narrative one, America still self-corrects, the win for rules, would be primarily embraced by traditional U.S. allies. Think Canada, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, countries that felt unfairly targeted by the blanket 10% tariff and the arbitrary reciprocal measures, despite being close security and economic partners.
How would they see the ruling?
They would see it as a vindication, proof that the U.S. system, particularly its independent judiciary, still functions as a meaningful check on executive overreach. It would restore some confidence that U.S. policy, in the long run, is bound by law and institutional constraints, not just the whims of whoever occupies the White House.
So good for long-term relationships and maybe trade deals.
Yes, it could make allies more willing to engage in long-term economic partnerships and negotiations. It might also provide a small but needed morale boost for the principles of the rules-based international trading system, embodied by the struggling World Trade Organization, WTO, suggesting that major players can still be held accountable to legal norms, at least domestically.
Okay, that's the optimistic take. But there's a competing narrative, right? A much more negative interpretation.
Absolutely. Narrative 2. America is paralytic, the win for rivals. This is the story that would be amplified by countries like China and Russia, and perhaps resonate with some nations in the global south that are wary of U.S. power or instability.
What's their angle?
Their propaganda machine would immediately seize on the ruling to say, look, America is hopelessly divided and dysfunctional. Their own Supreme Court had to strike down their president's signature economic policy because they couldn't even follow their own laws. They'd portray it as evidence of weakness and internal chaos.
So using the ruling to argue the U.S. can't govern itself effectively.
Precisely. This narrative feeds into an existing global trend. Countries diversifying their economic and political relationships away from heavy reliance on the United States. They see the constant political fragmentation, the policy whiplash between administrations, and now a major policy being struck down by the courts, and they conclude that America is too unpredictable, too internally conflicted to be a reliable, long-term strategic partner. So they hedge their bets, strengthen ties elsewhere.
So the same ruling can simultaneously reassure allies about the rule of law and convince rivals and others that the U.S. is too gridlocked to lead effectively.
It's complicated.
It reflects the complex reality of America's global standing right now. Strengths in institutions versus perceived weakness in political coherence.
Let's bring it home now to the domestic political battlefield. This ruling, striking down the tariff man's signature policy, has to be a major blow to the administration, right? The source material asks if it's a bleak spot. Is it? On a purely substantive level, yes, it's a huge defeat. It dismantles a cornerstone of their economic agenda. It forces a policy retreat. It potentially requires returning billions in collected revenue. It's objectively a significant loss on the policy front.
But politics isn't always about objective policy results, is it?
Not in the current climate. While it's a policy setback, it's probably not politically fatal for the administration. In fact, the strategy would likely be to immediately turn the loss into a grievance.
How does that work? How do you spin losing a major Supreme Court case, especially one where your own appointees might have voted against you, into a political positive?
You shift the narrative instantly. You stop talking about, I delivered these tariffs, and start shouting about, they stopped me. The administration would immediately pivot to blaming activist judges, the deep state courts, the globalist establishment, or maybe even rhinos, Republicans in name only, in Congress who didn't support them strongly enough.
So play the victim card.
Exactly. Frame it as the president fighting for the American worker, using the only tools available, only to be thwarted by unelected elites who don't understand the struggles of ordinary people. This message resonates powerfully with the core base. It reinforces their existing sense of being under siege, and it transforms a policy failure into fuel for political mobilization. The grievance becomes the point.
What about within the Republican Party itself? This must be causing some serious internal friction, given the party's historical divisions on trade.
Oh, absolutely. This ruling would pour gasoline on those existing fires. It sharpens the divide within the GOP.
Between which factions?
Between the ascendant populist nationalist wing, which strongly supports tariffs and protectionism, and the more traditional pro-business free market wing. The populace will be enraged by the ruling and demand immediate, aggressive legislative action to reinstate tariffs, perhaps even more sweeping ones.
And the pro-business Republicans.
Many of them were privately deeply uncomfortable with the way these broad IEEPA tariffs were imposed, the unilateralism, the lack of process, the collateral damage to allies and supply chains. While they might not say so publicly, many will be quietly relieved by the court striking them down.
Relieved. Why?
Because it gives them political cover. They can now argue, we support protecting American workers, but we need to do it legally and smartly. It allows them to advocate for more targeted measures, perhaps specific anti-dumping duties or subsidies, rather than the blunt, economy-wide taxes imposed by IEPA. It potentially gives them an opening to try and steer the party back towards a more conventional, less disruptive trade policy approach without directly confronting the populist base head-on over the goal of protectionism itself.
Fascinating internal dynamics. Now, what about the Democrats? This seems like a clear win for them on the rule of law argument.
It is. Democrats can and will claim vindication. Their core message will be, see, we told you the president was exceeding his authority. Congress controls the power to tax, not one person acting like a king. It reinforces their arguments about constitutional norms and checks and balances.
But they have to be careful too, right? They don't want to look like they're just rooting for free trade at any cost, which isn't popular with parts of their own base either.
Exactly. But that's the tightrope they have to walk. They need to celebrate the constitutional victory without appearing soft on unfair trade practices or indifferent to the concerns of American workers who feel left behind by globalization.
So what's the likely Democratic strategy?
The smart play is to quickly pivot from just criticizing the administration's methods to proposing their own smarter legal, industrial, and trade policy. This would likely involve emphasizing things like investing in domestic manufacturing, subsidies, R&D, enforcing existing trade laws more rigorously, working with allies to counter unfair practices, especially from China, and ensuring strong labor and environmental standards are part of any trade framework. The goal is to look tough and strategic on trade, but also constitutionally sound, drawing a contrast with the administration's unilateral, arguably unlawful approach.
So everyone's trying to reposition. The administration pivots from tariffs to other tools. What are the main paths forward for them? You mentioned a legislative push.
Yes, path one is legislative tariffs, call it Tariff 2.0. Having been blocked by the court, the administration's most logical and perhaps politically necessary move is to go straight to Congress and demand they pass a new law explicitly authorizing broad tariff authority.
A Tariff Authorization Act.
Something like that. They basically dare Congress. You say I don't have the power. Fine, give it to me. This would be a high-stakes political gamble.
Why a gamble?
Because success is far from guaranteed. Would enough Republicans, especially the more traditional ones, vote to grant such broad, open-ended tariff power? Would any Democrats come along? If the administration succeeds in getting a bill passed, they get durable, legally sound tariff authority, though likely narrower than what they tried under IEPA. But if they fail, if Congress refuses to grant the power,
it validates the court's ruling and makes the administration look weaker, unable to even get its own party in Congress to back its core policy.
Exactly. Failure would powerfully underscore the court's message. The president cannot act alone on this scale, and the legislative branch isn't willing to give him that power either.
Okay, so if path one, the legislative fix, looks too risky or fails, what's path two? What are the other tools they lean on?
Path 2 is leaning harder on targeted tools that are already within the executive's toolkit and generally on firmer legal ground. We touched on these earlier.
Remind us.
More industrial subsidies channeling government money to favored sectors like semiconductors, electric vehicles, green energy, maybe others deemed strategic. More aggressive use of targeted sanctions against specific companies or countries for specific offenses, human rights proliferation, etc. Basically, using IEPA for its original intended purpose.
What else?
Strengthening Buy American rules to try and boost domestic demand through government purchasing. And significantly, ramping up the use of export controls, especially on advanced technologies, to strategically limit the capabilities of rivals like China. This involves restricting U.S. companies from selling certain sensitive goods or technologies abroad.
So the overall approach becomes less about a broad import tax and more about a complex web of subsidies, targeted sanctions, government procurement rules, and technology denial.
Yes. It's a shift from a blunt instrument, broad tariffs, to a more surgical, complex, and arguably more bureaucratic form of industrial policy and strategic competition. It requires managing many different levers rather than just pulling one big one. #outro.
Well, this has been an incredibly detailed exploration of a truly pivotal potential moment. If the Supreme Court does strike down these emergency tariffs, we've seen it triggers immediate economic consequences, the messy refund process, shifts in prices, impacts on specific industries. But the ripples go so much further.
They really do.
The lasting impact, as you've laid out so clearly, is constitutional. It's the court potentially drawing a very firm line, defending the separation of powers and emphasizing that even in a fast-moving world, policy has to be made lawfully through the processes outlined in the Constitution. It's about maintaining constitutional hygiene.
That's exactly right. And I think, stepping back, if this ruling happens, as we've discussed, historians won't primarily remember it as a case about tariffs or trade economics. They'll see it as a turning point in the modern understanding of presidential power. By invoking the major questions doctrine so forcefully, especially concerning the core congressional power of taxation, the court would be sending an unmistakable message to the executive branch, present and future. Your emergency powers have limits. You cannot run a complex 21st century national economic strategy, let alone an industrial policy based on strained interpretations of old statutes and a perpetual, vaguely defined state of emergency. Process matters. The Constitution's structure matters.
Which leads us directly to our final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to ponder after this deep dive.
Yeah.
We discussed a scenario where the court checks executive overreach. But consider this. If the executive branch is blocked from implementing its preferred, sweeping policies unilaterally through emergency powers,
And if the legislative branch, Congress, remains as gridlocked, polarized, and often dysfunctional as it frequently seems today, seemingly incapable of passing clear, decisive, major legislation on complex issues like trade, industrial policy, or climate change,
then does the American system, as currently constituted and practiced, actually possess the capacity to adopt and sustain the kind of coherent, long-term strategic policies, whether on trade, technology, or other major challenges that are arguably needed to navigate and compete effectively in an increasingly turbulent and competitive global landscape?
That is the unanswered and perhaps unsettling question that hangs over this entire debate. Can a system designed with strong checks and balances function effectively when the branches are locked in conflict or paralysis? Finding the answer to that question might be the central challenge for American governance in the decade to come.